Welcome back to Living Outside the Matrix. In this episode, the topic under discussion is the Great Reset. I've got a fantastic interview which I'm excited to share with you with a writer and researcher from the United States called Shannon Rowan. But before we get to that, I just wanted to frame the conversation by showing you a couple of clips from David Ansara's Centre for Research Analysis. It's an interview with Douglas Kruger. And the benefit of these clips helps give us a clue to the deception that is the Great Reset and the way that it's being presented, in that it contrasts the fine words and claims of altruistic intent with the harsh reality of what that actually means. Here's the first clip.
What is this idea of the Great Reset exactly, and what are some of the risks attached to it?
Like many of the politically correct ideas that we hear bandied about in the media, this entire project is couched in kindness. It is presented as something that is being done or being proposed for our good and for the greater good. And that always sets my alarms and sensors going, because that tends to lead to very problematic ideology. In a very quick nutshell, the proposal out of Davos is essentially this: a group of exceptionally powerful individuals, predominantly in the banking, finance, and business sector, in alliance with government leadership, are proposing that as a result of these COVID lockdowns that have done a great deal of damage to economies globally, they perceive that they now have an opportunity to rebuild economies, but to do so in what they believe is a more enlightened fashion. And there are generally speaking, there are problems with the idea of groups of people in power deciding the history of humanity. In a best case scenario, we are simply supposed to be free to determine our own futures, our own progress, what we want out of life. Now, in this particular case, what they're proposing is a sort of collectivist idea that takes personal ownership out of the equation. The little phrase, and it sounds so innocent, is "you will own nothing and you will be happy." Now, if you go back just several hundred years, the founding father and first president of the United States, which was essentially a project founded on the idea of human liberty and freedom, pretty much for the first time in modern history, George Washington said, "There is no such thing as personal human rights without property ownership." And he said that for several very interesting and important reasons. But the principle is sound. If you are dependent on a greater power for everything, then you are not free. You place yourself as an individual in quite a precarious situation. It was, in fact, the formula for living, the sort of political reality for most of human history. If you look back at a simple setup like the serfs of Europe, this is a group of people who owned nothing and simply contributed to the overlord who determined what they could and could not have. And they had zero rights. It is the property that you own that actually ensures your rights to a great degree. So while this may sound like a very enlightened idea, sort of a communal, collectivist utopia, there are many problems with this once you start thinking about how it might actually be implemented. And that's what concerns me.
I think it's really important to stress here that these powerful people don't really think that their plan is a more enlightened one to make things better for humanity. This is just the ruse. This is the scam. This is the lie. Essentially, they just want to further their own political agenda of control, so that they in their cliquey club, the haves at the top, the powerful people who've seized control, get to lord it over and design a system that helps them control and exploit the ordinary person like you and me.
Now, the sorts of things that we're hearing from Davos and from the likes of the proponents of the Great Reset all talk about collectivist and communal living and how nobody will own anything. But now consider for just a second, that is already a fallacy. Someone, somewhere, has to own. And in fact, what happens is, if you take ownership out of the hands of a broad-based populace and of many separate entrepreneurs and families and individuals, and you concentrate it into the hands of, say, a few multinational corporations working together with government, well, firstly, that system is by definition fascistic. This idea of an all-powerful government and the businesses that work in conjunction with them. It leads very quickly to cronyism to the types of corruption that we see, particularly in South Africa, where we are so keen on talking about business and government collaborating. And doesn't that just sound like such a good thing? Business and government collaborating. What happens there is you have the people who own the rules, enforce right and wrong, and have a financial incentive to be corrupt, working with the people who have the money and have an incentive to corrupt them. It's a dreadful formula just to begin with. However, what concerns me is perhaps on a bigger scale than that. When we talk about collective ownership, we are often told that the great thing about it is that everybody will own. The reality of the thing is that nobody but those in power own. And that impulse to take away private property ownership and to concentrate it into the hands of a representative government is purely Marxist. I mean, it is the heart and soul of the Marxist idea, which stripped down to its basics is nobody owns property, it is collectively owned. And as I say, of course, the fallacy there is that it is not actually collectively owned. It is owned by those in power. Now, what can go wrong with that? Well, if we look at modern day China, we get a very good example of this one. Modern day China, of course, a bit of a mixed economy. They have prospered to the degree that they've started permitting free trade. However, they are still very much a Marxist society. And they work according to social credit scores. And social credit scores imposed by law represent a very chilling idea. Now imagine this, for example. You as a family do not own your home. You do not own what is around you. You do not own your business. The government has absolute control because they are the representative of collective ownership. Now imagine a scenario in which you do something that the government does not approve of. You read a book that it doesn't want you to read. You write an essay or an article that it doesn't like. You create a YouTube video commenting on something in a negative way. Now, those are all things that productive human beings do to critique and build and grow their society. But you can't do it there. And if you do something that the government disapproves of, using these social credit scores, they can ghost you. They can effectively lock you out of your world. And it works because you don't own anything. It is that ownership, that broad-based private ownership, that keeps people free from government tyranny. Maggie Thatcher from the UK very famously embarked on a project to expand human liberty in her nation by trying to ensure as much broad-based private and individual ownership of property as possible. In that, she was in agreement with George Washington, who said that it is property rights that prop up human freedom.
The Great Reset is the big push to impose collectivism, which means the individual, like you and me, becoming subordinate to or sacrificed to the group. The Great Reset is a continuation and a culmination of the control of education initiated by the Carnegie Foundation last century, the control of medicine initiated by the Rockefeller Foundation last century, and the control of politics for at least the last century, as exposed by Carroll Quigley in his book Tragedy and Hope. Now, some people argue over whether the causes of what we see happening today, the political loss of freedom, the impending collectivism, as to whether or not this is some kind of communism or whether it's fascism or is it nationalism. What is it? What's the essence of what's going on? But people who divide these things out and consider them to be different are not grasping that in essence their fundamental root is the same. They are all forms of statism, and it is statism that is the fundamental problem. Statism is the means by which to implement the the policies of the eugenics movement, of the technocracy movement, of all these different factions of that parasite class who have hijacked governments and seized control. Statism is the perfect vehicle for them to realize their designs and their policies to effect global control over the ordinary person like you and I. So let's move on to our interview with Shannon Rowan. She's an absolute wealth of information, really interesting conversation I had with her. Unfortunately, we were interrupted by the internet cutouts occasionally. So do bear with us on that. But it's a fantastic interview. And the first thing I began with was to find out, or I asked her to share with us, what inspired her to begin researching and writing.
Well, it's been a little bit of a long journey, but basically my background actually is in journalism. So I was an editorial photographer and writer, and I've done work for newspapers as well. And I think I was already being disillusioned working for news agencies, seeing how they misused my photographs, misrepresented like my intention behind them just by having like a subheading under them that was misleading. I worked in advertising as well, and definitely saw all the tricks used in that industry to deceive people. So I was kind of seeing, my eyes were being opened pretty early on, right out of college, to like just disillusioned with everything, and then really starting to question. I start learning that like news was censored a certain way, and and then it was really the Great Awakening. I don't know if there's a Great Awakening moment. I was already like teamed up with John Hamer before the pandemic stuff. So we were working on, I'll backtrack a little bit. I actually became really adversely affected by wireless radiation in my home city of Washington, D.C., and had to leave because I got so sick. So this is when the smart meters went on my home without me knowing. And then I got a smartphone and the 4G was turned on, and I started having, horrible symptoms, migraines that wouldn't go away, and, debilitating, just cognitive dysfunction, brain fog, insomnia, night sweats, joint pain, but like massive headaches and chest pain too, and heart arrhythmias. And that's where I got really worried about the exposures. And I started learning that they were really harmful. And then, you learn about industry cover up and the government collusion. And so, of course, you're like, that alone just started to make me question a lot, like everything. I thought I had been questioning before and open-minded, but, that really pushed me into like seeking more truth. And then, of course, the whatever you want to call it, scamdemic, like really just was like, wow, okay, I knew there were all these plans in the works, but like I didn't really expect that. And that card being played, and it was kind of like the perfect card to play once you kind of see where it's all leading. And I mean, kind of felt obvious to me, but a lot of people obviously didn't see it, and some people, it really did help awaken them in that kind of crisis, and seeing like how quickly these governments work together with with industry and to lock us down, and to oppress us, and so quickly. So that like just led to more books. I was already writing a book with John Hamer that we put on hold because of that happening. That was about the transhuman agendas and related to EMF harm, and then I wrote about my journey in Wi-Fi refugee, about like what I was just saying, how I got affected and how I had to flee. So that's kind of how that happened. Yeah.
So the book you were writing with John Hamer, that was Welcome to the Masquerade. Yes, the what's it called? It's the prelude to the coming reset.
Right.
So yes, I guess this it was the alleged pandemic that for a lot of us was a big wake up call, wasn't it? And of course, Klaus Schwab used that as his opportunity to launch the Great Reset. So, I mean, the Great Reset. What's your take on the Great Reset?
Well, it's also called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's basically merging humans with machines. It is transhumanism, or rather, I think, replacing humans with machines. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Schwab and Mallory write about in their book, COVID-19, The Great Reset, which is like, this is basically their stance is this is a great opportunity for us to like just restart everything, reset, not just reset the economy, but societies, cultures, people. And they said, this is going to be like a great upheaval, a great dividing and kind of tearing apart of the social fabric and that we've had for so long. And it's going to happen quickly in unexpected ways, and that machines are going to be replacing people. But it's all okay. We're going to be happy because we won't own anything. And then we're going to merge with these systems, and then we'll just let like AI take over. And I mean, that's basically what it's about. It's pretty insane. And it's quite interesting to me, the kind of nerve they have of just like coming out and saying all this, like as if like they're admitting like they are kind of orchestrating this and they want to be the masters of the universe, and they're just like, well, we're just doing this,
Yes.
you're going to go along with it.
It's very much enforced upon us, or the way they've unveiled the plan is that, this is what we're going to do, just get ready for it. It's interesting that you've mentioned the transhumanism part of the agenda there. That's not one I'd readily associated. I mean, I've heard Klaus Schwab sort of announce his the Great Reset as essentially a fundamental restructuring of the global economy, of every national economy together in this global economy, not just one or two nations as a trial run, but the whole thing. And I also note that it's presented as an altruistic thing, isn't it? It's presented as we're doing this all for your benefit, which I think is rather sinister, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I can quote you from the book, what he says, where they bring in this like transhumanist ideas. So it says that the fourth industrial revolution might, in fact, in its most pessimistic, dehumanized form, hold the potential to robotize humanity, as in their words, and thus to deprive us of our heart and soul. They are coming out and saying that this is the potential that it has. And they mentioned human augmentation. That's like one of the terms they use basically to get us on board with like this idea that we're going to just be augmented. Don't worry, But they also said that, oh, wait 1 second. Okay, so this was said in 2019. Schwab said this at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. What the fourth industrial revolution will lead to is a fusion of our physical, digital, and biological identities. So that digital identity, right, like fusing with the physical, is basically the crux of transhumanism. It's this idea that we're going to merge with these systems. And it's funny to me they call it a revolution at all. It's not a revolution by, for, and of the people. It's like you said, it's being imposed upon us.
Yes.
So.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, I've previously seen the Great Reset coming as more of a or I see it as more of a threat to our freedom through our loss of property rights. We'll come back to the transhumanism, the sort of singularity, Ray Kurzweil's idea in a moment, maybe. But I'm very concerned when I first heard the slogan, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. This is a very open, overt attack on property rights. And I'm concerned that, without property rights, there are no rights. Property rights are the only real expression and manifestation of our rights. If we are not allowed to own anything, then we're utterly dependent. We have no freedom, effectively. Do you see this as a major threat as well?
Absolutely. And that's all kind of linked to like Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. And this is actually, so the WEF, World Economic Forum, which, we kept talking about Klaus Schwab, he's the head of, he founded it, is directly linked with like the UN agendas, which are, allegedly about sustainability. I mean, they use these terms that, like, again, sound altruistic, but it has nothing to do with actual sustainability for human cultures and societies and for our own lives. It's really what they consider to be sustainable for them and their billionaire lifestyles to keep, jet setting around. And like this, none of this applies to them losing their own properties, because what's happening is you have these public-private relationships, partnerships, PPPs. And so that's really just corrupt government. That's another way of saying corrupt government, because you're talking about industry and government working hand in glove. And, and then like buying up land and owning it. I mean, right now, the US government owns more than 45% of our land, which is crazy. Like, this is a huge continent. They own like half of it already. What are they doing with it? So then they get to tell us like if we can go on it or not and use it or not, and how we get to use it or not. And like the pandemic is a perfect example of like that, taking that power and just showing us right then that they can just deny us all access to all land. They'd say, oh, the pandemic, you can't enter the parks anymore, or only this much, or you can't even walk on a beach that maybe you even like have a house right next to. that you walked on every day of your life, and suddenly you can't even access land. This idea of smart cities and moving us into these cities to protect nature, allegedly. I mean, it's, first of all, it's a lie, because all the proposals for what they talk about protecting nature actually harm nature. So when you start putting surveillance everywhere in nature, those waves, those millimeter microwaves, actually harm nature. So, but Agenda 2030 particularly says, I have this quoted too in my book, the last book, Shots Fired, that in when was this? Like, they said that land in particular needs to be taken away from people. Can I quote? I'll quote this if you'd like.
Yeah, please do.
It says, "Land, because of its unique nature and crucial role it plays in human settlement, cannot be treated as an ordinary asset controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership also is a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth, and therefore contributes to social injustice. Social injustice, urban renewal and development, the provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for people can only be achieved if land is used in the interests of society as a whole."
Yeah.
So yeah, you want to say something
dreadful.
about that? Yeah.
Well, it's dreadful. I mean, the first thing I wanted to pick up on is the public-private partnerships. Again, more lovely, fluffy sounding cooperative language, but that's in fact fascism. People often forget that as soon as the state partners with corporations, effectively controlling them, it's reminiscent of the famous phrase, own nothing and control everything. I don't know whether it was one of the Rockefellers that said that. But it's effectively the state controlling things without owning them. So, the sort of tag team of government and big corporations, that is the essence of fascism. So it's very important for people to note that. And I'm always intrigued by the two fasci either side in your country, in Washington there. I can't remember whether it's in the Senate building, and one of the big auditoriums where your seat of democracy, alleged seat of democracy, occurs. There's two fasci either side, which I find absolutely extraordinary, that always seems to escape people's attention.
Right, of course.
But yes, land ownership is integral to freedom, isn't it? It's absolutely crucial that people have somewhere to escape to sort of recoup, to take a breather from the fight. And if a landless people are they cannot possibly be a free people, can they?
No.
So do you see? We have a number of threads that are sort of have come together in the lead up to the announcement of this great reset, COVID being one of them, the environmental card you've also mentioned being another. Are there any other key ingredients, do you think, that have been in the lead up?
Well, I do think that the technology, like us getting us more addicted and tethered to devices, and like actually a lot of movements like minimalist movement, even again, like to focus on not owning anything, but living, kind of getting us to live in like more of a virtual reality. A lot of the extreme minimalists don't have anything, but they'll have like VR glasses, headsets, and like they live not in their empty apartment, because who wants to live in an empty apartment, but like in this other world. But now, like Mark Zuckerberg calls it metaverse. He's starting to try to get people to like live there, and he even says things like, think about the kind of things in your life that don't need to be physical. They could be holograms. Maybe you don't need to be physical. You could be a hologram. I mean, that's what this is leading up to. Literally, there's plans in place to get us to live as avatars or as holograms. Wouldn't that be great for the environment? Allegedly, of course it wouldn't be. But I mean, this is where it's just, but I really feel like, okay, to me, the whole last few years we've lived out this nightmare, dystopian nightmare, wouldn't have been possible without first getting people addicted to the technology, because first of all, they wouldn't have been able to coordinate this on such a massive scale and have people get that news like instantaneously in their news feed on their devices that they carry around with them everywhere. To get them to like get the updates of like wear a mask, don't wear a mask, wear 3 masks, don't wear them, go, you can go here, you can't go here, and like know about it. And I wasn't using that, and I didn't keep up with it. I didn't care about, I was ignoring it, but I saw that other people were like, they got their phones and they got their mask on. Did you know? And I'm not wearing one. Did you know there's another there's another variant, and they said we had to wear masks again. And look, it's right here. So we got
Yes.
that happening, and the fact that people were like more comfortable with lockdowns because they're sort of like already disconnecting themselves from nature and moving more indoors. And then that just pushed it and encouraged it more. All this, some resistance before the pandemic to screen learning and telehealth and tele everything was kind of like, oh, well, now I guess we're going to start using this because I made choice. And so then just getting people to so-called like warm up to this, warm up to robots coming into our lives and AI taking over and everything.
Yeah.
So that's definitely been a key ingredient in like us being able to move us into this next stage, the reset and the fourth industrial revolution.
Yes. I see also the talk of AI. We have chatbot GPT, of course, and a general sort of conversation around AI going on quite prominently this year. That seems to be again sort of softening the public up. Personally, I have my doubts that AI is what it's presented as being. I think it's more of a ruse to sort of usher in the machines, as you said, replace people, and possibly even who knows, ultimately blame decisions on AI. Oh, it wasn't us, the AI said do it. Who knows? But it's definitely a part of softening people up. Also, the climate issue, I think,
Right.
certainly in this country, so widely bought into. There are very few thinking people that actually sort of rubbish the climate narrative. If you sort of stop on a street corner and ask people, almost everyone has bought into it. And it always seemed to me during COVID that this must have sort of been an indicator to those powers that shouldn't be, that the public is ripe and ready for this next great ruse. And lo and behold, as you say, everybody was reaching for their masks and complying as eagerly as possible, weren't they? What do you see happening in terms of bringing in this great reset, given that it has been announced or trumpeted as a sort of an economic reset primarily, notwithstanding what we just said? Do you think there's likely to be some kind of engineered crisis or something big happening to usher it in?
Well, yeah, I mean, that seems to work really well. So the problem, I think, though, that people are getting like what they would call like pandemic weary or fatigue about that. But like you said, people have bought into the environmental thing, the climate crisis. And so that could just be the next card they play, where we say, well, we have to lock down because of the climate change. And you can see that kind of upping that game with the news. Anytime there's a hot day or, it's like, oh, and those thermometers are kept in cities now. They used to have them in the countryside too. So, there's always more heat in the cities because of all the pavement and everything. So they
Heat
can say
island
like,
effect, yeah.
yeah, and you're gonna be like, oh, look, it's hotter. Although it's interesting because allegedly we're in a solar minimum now, and that the world has already cooled several degrees. And I've read this in like the mainstream as well. And, they even called it like the sun is in lockdown, during our lockdown, saying that like, oh, this is solar minimum and the earth is cooled this many degrees, but we still have climate problem, that didn't solve our global warming to have it cool by a few degrees. Wouldn't that have just solved everything we should be celebrating? No. It's some complicated thing. They, model that's actually we still have climate change. And yeah, so with the climate change card, the potential to restrict our movements and take away property is massive. Because when you look at what's already happening with, actually, I know somebody personally, her family for generations owned land by the coast, and the government took it, saying that they needed to preserve that land. It was an important, habitat for whatever. And they're tying this into this like climate thing and how, so we have to, they'll just come through and say like, they can say, well, no, we need to rewild your land. This suburbia here, it can't happen. Like you have to all leave. You have to go into the cities. We can only have people living in like high tech surveillance cities where your energy usage, there's going to be carbon credits, personal carbon credits. It takes this much carbon footprint. If you eat that, So like we're talking about extreme oppression, extreme micromanagement, loss of liberty, for the good of all, for sustainability, alleged sustainability goals. So I mean, this is extreme. They're already doing actually over in England. I saw some. I was watching a podcast about how some of the high streets, was being now they were stopping all through traffic, saying, we can't have through traffic in this area, because of emissions and whatever and noise. And so all these shops were going under, again, like attack on local businesses, attack on property ownership, because they all tie together, like our ability to, have our own businesses outside of like the system, and have our own commerce and engage in that. And yeah, and owning land and resources is crucial to having liberty. You don't have it without that. I mean, you just cannot have it. So yeah, this idea that land ownership is bad and leads to social injustice is absurd, especially when we're talking about these elite, self-proclaimed elitists who are billionaires who have tons of land and resources. They're not going to give that up. It's not about them. It's about us, the proletarian classes. We're the problem. And we are not the problem. If anybody can destroy the earth and has the power to do that, it is them. We don't have that power. We will never have that kind of power. They have it. So it's ridiculous to say that any of our usage of electricity or anything can possibly create any kind of devastation environmentally. It's absurd.
It seems that a lot of people have said rather that climate lockdowns are very likely next on the agenda. There were a number of newspapers and commentators, within the mainstream that were sort of championing the fact that the climate had benefited during the COVID lockdowns. Yeah. And that they were, insanely jealous of this tool, the climate lobby, in order to save the planet. I mean, do you think that a credible, viable means of resistance is to try and challenge this climate and indeed the whole sort of bogus scamdemic narrative? Do you think that the best resistance is to try to put out the truth, try to persuade people? Do you think it's a conversation that we need to be having, or do you think our focus needs to be on the political level? Where do you? I don't mean to jump ahead too much, because
it's okay.
It's nice to be solution orientated, but it just seems relevant to put that in here. Given that it's been so widely bought into, the climate lie, do you think that's something that we should be trying to do, in our personal lives, persuading people?
Absolutely, because I don't think we're going to win on the political level, because that's already been taken over by the same forces that we're talking about. Getting a new face in office isn't going to do anything, because it's just so corrupt. It's about us resisting and understanding it's a lie so that we can resist. And if you don't understand that, obviously you won't resist. So, I mean, of course, I believe that it's important to educate people, and that's why I'm writing books, and that's why I'm doing this, hoping to lift that veil and let people see the truth and what's happening. And actually, one of my next books I'm planning is specifically focused on this climate lie and this greenwashing that's going on. Because it is so important that we see that and understand that. And I'm coming from a background of somebody who has been like, okay, I used to kind of consider myself to be liberal, in that I cared about social injustice and in the environment and everything else. And actually, I do still care about all those things. But now I see that I was misled and I was used. Like my ability to care about those things was used against me. So we should care about the environment, of course. But in terms of sustainability, but I don't really want to use their terms, but in terms of not polluting it, obviously it's a smart move to not pollute your water and food sources and your air. But see, they're not even focusing on all the chemicals in the environment or stop that. It's always, during the lockdowns, they were localized. It looked like clear. Oh, the sky is cleaner. Obviously, you're in a city and people aren't using vehicles. It's going to look like that. But meanwhile, in the factories in Beijing and other places in China and Southeast Asia, full speed ahead with making billions of masks and syringes. So, I mean, they never show us the big picture. Big picture wise, this whole idea and this whole fourth industrial revolution is going to be devastating for the environment with the what they call e-waste, electronic waste. No talk about what's going to happen if we all go over to electric cars. All the other cars we had, where do they go? What happens with the batteries from these things? Where the mining is happening? What components are used? How that impacts the environment? How you have to burn fossil fuels or whatever somewhere down the line to get the electricity for the cars. So, I mean, these solutions that are offered are absurd. They don't help our environment. They don't help anybody except they help our, lords and masters to control us, to limit our movements.
Indeed. It's all part of the ruse, isn't it? It really sort of gives the lie to the sort of claims to be doing it for the environment, when one just does a little bit of thinking and scratches beneath the surface and uncovers the sorts of things that you've just mentioned there. Batteries for electric cars being quite an obvious one. Shannon, do you see this whole thing, this great reset, as being a natural extension of agendas that have been pursued throughout last century? The sort of the Quigley formula, Carroll Quigley and his revelations, controlling both sides of the political spectrum. As long as you're going towards collectivism, it doesn't really matter what happens. Do you see this as a continuation, or indeed perhaps a culmination?
Yeah, maybe both. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these plans have been in the works for a really long time, and just again, a little research and you can uncover this, and these players, how they're interconnected. I mean, I think it's Maurice Strong in the 1970s actually admitted in one of these, reports about sustainability that they just had to they invented the climate thing in order to get everybody on board with all these changes they had planned for us to get, to see. They want us to see man as the ultimate enemy to man, to all the what we need to survive. Like our own enemy is us, allegedly, not them. And it's interesting because when they say things like that, to me, it just shows us that they don't see themselves as being human. They see themselves apart, somehow. And it reminds me, like the Matrix movies, you've got the aliens, that are saying like humans are a virus, you're the problem on the planet, you're the cancer of the earth, which is exactly the kind of terms that these elites have used. That indicates to me that they see themselves as non-human and that we're different. And that's why they don't mind messing with us and changing us into something, replacing us with robots. They kind of used the slave labor. They need it from us to get where they are in order to amass the wealth and amass the power. I mean, because at some point, money doesn't matter anymore when you own everything, when you have control of everything. And when you have billions of dollars, it's not about money anymore, because a lot of people argue and say, well, if they go ahead with these plans, then don't they need us as consumers to, create profits? No, they don't anymore, because they already have their positions of power. That was a means to an end, and now they have that. So they don't really need the capitalist model anymore as it's been. Yes. They actually just rather replace us with like automated things, the AI and everything, because they don't really, because they feel like they have to now take care of us and they don't want to pay for us anymore.
Yes, I do see that point. I understand it, but I don't agree with it. I think in the short term, you can sort of turn everything upside down and not require the consumer, the producer, and not require freedom. But I strongly suspect, for a number of reasons that I won't go into here, that the whole momentum of the production and the whole viability of their model without us is doomed to fail ultimately. I mean, when slavery is overt, when it really comes out, and as you alluded to earlier there, where people are actually asked to move away from their property. I mean, this is really where we really come to the crux of it, isn't it? I mean, at that point, I imagine that they wouldn't, there's no sort of turning back then. That's once the political bars are fully in place. But once that does happen, and you have a slave race, the incentive to cooperate and to fuel some big machine would vanish overnight. And I suspect that the fallover may take a few decades, but nevertheless, it's a very real problem in the in the now, isn't it? I mean, we're faced with imminently this great reset happening, and because Klaus Schwab has said, or the World Economic Forum slogan is, "You will have nothing and you will be happy." This rather implies that confiscation could be on the agenda, couldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I was just going to say, you reminded me of, well, China's been the model, like for the World Economic Forum. They love China. Oh, everything China's done is great, and they always praising them. They're the first to have a national digital currency, and they were trialing that, of course, during lockdowns, and the social credit systems. And what's interesting is that so if you look at China and you look at how oppressed people are, and you have like the examples of like severe examples of like, literal slaves like locked in their buildings, factories where they have to work and create like our iPhones for us, right? Those building people were so, of course, they're so resistant to that and upset by it that they're killing them. The suicide rate really high. So what was happening in one case in particular was that the workers were going to the top of the building and jumping off of it. And they had so many workers doing this that guess what their solution was? Not to improve conditions, not to give them any freedoms or anything, but to put a net so that they couldn't kill themselves by those means anymore.
That's shocking, isn't it?
It's shocking. And it's so sad and tragic, but like, we need to really consider that is a real possibility for us. Yes, we won't want to do, once we realize, like when it's really overt and we realize we are slaves and we're stuck in these smart cities, and we have to do whatever job is dictated to us that we have to do, and no matter how much we hate it, and we don't see our lives getting better. I mean, suicide rates were like greatly heightened during the lockdowns. Of course, that's a natural, people lost their jobs forever. In some cases, they don't see a way out. They don't see hope. And when you don't have hope, of course, that what happens. But yeah, they could be so controlled that you just don't even have the means to kill yourself. I mean, that's how sad it could be and how horrible it could be. And this is why people have to understand how real this threat is and how important it is to resist now when we still have a chance.
Absolutely. What do you say then? Sorry to interject there, but what do you say then to the people? And we all hear this. Oh, that could never happen here, or variations on that kind of response. Because now when we look around us, we do still have that illusion of freedom, and it is a thin facade illusion of freedom. Really, we have lost freedom already, and it's just a question of when it's maybe politically acceptable to make the next move. So, what do you say to those people that make such utterances?
I would say think about 2020 and the outset of that year, and the kind of things that happened in quick succession that you would never have thought could have possibly happened in your country. It happened. It actually happened. Police came to people's doors when people were shot with rubber bullets in this country who were breaking curfew because they were sitting on their porches in the evening past curfew. I mean, there were drones yelling at people to go back inside. I mean, I didn't live in those places. Luckily, this was more like in urban areas and high population areas. But you might think that, okay, I don't live in those cities, so I'm okay. But it's not going to stop there. I mean, like we were saying, you can come, they could take you off your land, say that like this is a fragile whatever. I mean, this kind of thing's happening with like water rights, with Native Americans, this kind of like reparations going on, to give it back. Like they're just using, it's so kind of funny to me that they're, these same people like didn't care about Native people at all, put them on reservations and everything. And now they're like suddenly care about them. Only when it serves their agenda to like imprison the rest of us. They'll just imprison the natives again too. That's easy enough. There's not that many of them left. They're already like really impoverished and living on these reservations. So yeah, people are being used. They need to see.
So Shannon, what do you see as the solutions that are available to us?
Well, non-consent is my first one. I mean, we do have that power still, and people need to exercise it. I did during the pandemic. I didn't go along with things, and I know a lot of other people didn't. There weren't as many of us, there was a lot of hysteria. I hope that people learn from that and kind of recognize now, like just how easily they were pushed and kind of manipulated and got hysterical and weren't thinking, got into that fear, like non-critical thinking mode. And to try to be aware that that could be triggered again and quite easily. But there's a lot of ways we can resist by not consenting to this and by forming our own kind of systems outside of this control grid. It is challenging. I mean, I admit that when 2020 rolled out and I saw what was happening, I was looking to flee, my country. I was like, whoa, saw the writing on the wall. Like, this is like definitely US is going to be part of this whole thing. But honestly, when I looked really hard and it didn't look like there was anywhere to escape to, which is how successful that was, which is really frightening. A lot of places that seemed like they used to be a good refuge for people trying to get away from the control systems were like worse, amazingly. Like, I'm thinking of Ecuador in particular. A lot of expats there, kind of fleeing this, they just honed in on places like that and just went all out. They had the most incredible curfews and restrictions and police enforced and everything, police at the grocery stores. You can only go in 20 minutes and that kind of thing. And so I'm like, well, maybe it's not so bad here. Still, I do actually think that in the US, we have a lot of people resisting, a lot of, it's like a kind of hopeful to me. There's definitely a pushback to all these things that happening over where you are too. So I think that people are waking up and they are seeing this and they maybe are not going to stand for it. And that's, but things like, securing property, like growing foods, having other people involved, just trying to have our own, we're going to probably have to be bartering. I mean, if they're going to push us into this like cashless society and digital banking with digital IDs and everything, where do we draw the line? We have to be thinking about that now. A lot of people are like, well, I'll draw the line here with like my use of technology that is invasive and surveillance and everything. And I make compromises myself, even using this platform in a way as a compromise. But we have to think about like how far we're going to go with that. I mean, because we say, well, I'm doing it for this reason, but what's the consequence, and what's going to happen with this trajectory? And so I'm myself, like, I spend time on the computer researching and use the internet and do shows, but the rest of the time I'm outside in nature and, have gardens, I'm growing food, I get out. Like, I'm not tethered to this stuff. I have to actually travel to use the internet. It's not at my house. I don't have a phone or internet at the house. I don't have electricity at the house. I mean, and I'm making this work. And I used to live in big cities, and I enjoy it. And I see a lot of people out here, and you get to meet people who are similar, like-minded, who are also escaping these smart cities, so-called. And but I think people who do want to stay in cities and that need to, like, they need to say something, do something. Don't let, go say, okay, I'm okay with using a QR code on my smartphone for everything. And like, I don't, no more paper menus, even at restaurants. I mean, that's just absurd. That's ridiculous. I mean, think about even if you're okay with it, who's being excluded? There's a lot of people being excluded by those kind of moves, and the vulnerability of these systems, greater dependency on them. It's so tenuous. It's like, it's even just in terms of how it changes us. The more we rely on these tools and like hand over our sovereignty to them, obviously we lose that. We lose the ability even to think for ourselves, to even make simple calculations, to remember things. The more we say entrust that to the machine, the more you lose that. So I think we need to, in order to just keep our own cognitive function and secure our brains, our memory, for our futures, while we're aging, is so important too. But just, I would say, to do all the opposite of what we're being encouraged to do. Like, we're being encouraged to stay inside more, to connect more on screens. Do the opposite of that. Go out and be with people and touch them and interact with them, whether or not you agree with them politically. It's so important that we bridge those divides and remember to see each other as still all humans and vulnerable, and not to judge each other that, oh, you got taken in, I didn't, I'm better. Like we're like, let's see each other authentically, let's live authentically and connect with each other. That's the real way we'll reach out like to each other and come together. Because they're always saying we're all in this together, that's their favorite thing, and in a sense it's true, but we don't need to be all in a FEMA camp together. Let's think about how we really want our futures to be. Yeah. Right.
It's an interesting balance between all being in it together and actually making a stand for individualism, because I think it's important to remember that individualism is the opposite of collectivism, and what the World Economic Forum are advocating in their Great Reset is pure collectivism. It's slavery almost. It's utter dependence, owning nothing, no property rights. Being shoved around by the state, and the individual is nothing. The individual is subordinated to the collective. And I think this is one area where people, could do a little bit of thinking here. The altruist card is always played, and people always fall for it. But in reality, the individual is the unit of humanity.
Right, exactly. And if we don't have individual rights, you don't have group rights either. I mean, this idea of like that we have to give up our own rights, and it's this guilt tripping, like, save granny, or like whatever. Like the problem is that it's these elite few who are dictating to us what community means, what group means, what we're supposed to, and the fact that like we then can accept like sacrifices for the group, collateral damage, right? That's the problem with it's a focus on the individuals again, like they compromise the group. So if we don't have individual rights, we don't have anything. No. And yeah, absolutely. And this collectivism actually could be also called communitarianism. Probably don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but
and communism.
You could call it that. It's all well, communitarianism predated communism, and it's actually the same people who like invented both. And I think that's coming back around, because communitarianism is a little bit different in that it sort of communism and capitalism, a different, so there is a capitalist element still, but the globalist capitalist model, right? And this whole, all the sustainability, all these terms we're hearing all the time are definitely communitarian terms. So, but you're absolutely right. We have to be aware that we are being played, and they use our best, parts of ourselves, like our empathy, against us. It's a tool against us. And we need to embrace the empathy and take it back and realize that we need to have empathy for ourselves and other individuals, and not just be used to start thinking about, the group. I mean, what is that? It's this abstract notion, really, and it is, and they're defining it for us. And that's what's really dangerous.
Yeah. I think it's very dangerous also to talk about group rights or any other rights. I mean, the concept of rights has been destroyed. I don't think most people actually know what rights are if you actually ask them. But the moral concept of rights has been destroyed by bringing in things like the right to education, the right to housing, the right to Medicare. There is no such thing as the right to anything that has to be produced or provided by another, because then that's then sort of the right to enslave somebody else to provide for you. So the very, I think something we could all do is actually, gen up on the concept of rights, because the rights as a concept is our means to freedom. It's the mechanism by which one group of people recognizes the rightful behavior of another, and because we're beings of a certain nature, we're human beings, it is right for us to think and act on our own judgment. This is our basic mode of survival, and it has to be right for us to think and act on our own judgment, to keep the property, the efforts of our own, the results of our own efforts, keep our property, these sorts of things. So it's very important to not blur rights with benefit privileges, which is obviously what the state hands out, and they can be reeled back in, of course, at any time. So that's something I would add to the work we do to know about rights. But I do love your assertion to not comply.
Yeah, I do. I'll just say something about that too, because one thing that I do to not participate is to not take any of the benefits from the state, right? It's all strings attached. Yes. Like, I'm going to take care of myself in whatever way I can. I'm not going to ask for those handouts. Once you do that, it's over. I mean, I don't want, what's fair housing? What does housing look like to these, psychopaths for us? Oh, equal and have housing, whatever. Like you said, it's all equally enslaved. So no, I think we need to be able to, our birthrights are like any other wild animal, is to breathe, clean, like move about freely, find our own food, like create our own wealth, breathe the air, eat food. I mean, food, shelter, all this should be free, like without money involved, really, like just like any other animal. I mean, suddenly it's like, oh, we want to preserve like wilderness areas for other animals and take it away from humans. Like, why are they more important than us? We should all have those birthrights. I mean, like, it makes us feel, I feel really different from, it's a weird feeling to be like, well, you have to, the way that you get to eat food and have shelter and clothing is that you have to go through this system and have this money that's like, has inflation and is always losing value, and you have to then have a job to do that. And like, we want to let these other creatures like have their absolute freedom, to live as a wild animal. Like, as we
I do think it's important to notice that we as a life form are fundamentally different from animals. Animals, where we humans are unique. Animals have automatic knowledge. They just have to graze, eat the berries, or whatever they do. They don't have to think and produce the values they need. So it's important to remember that human beings are fundamentally different, and the concepts of money and exchange are perfectly valid, because each and every one of us has to think, work, and produce the values we need, or an equivalent to exchange for what we need, as our mode of survival. That's the human mode of living. So, but I do think it's an absurdity to actually promote animals above humans and to make humans the problem. That's just nonsense.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're tool makers. We're totally fundamentally different from other animals in those ways. But I mean, in terms of money, yes, in terms of commerce, exchange, and goods and services and things, and using something like money is okay, but not when you get like this Federal Reserve involved, where they've totally taken control of that and destroyed it for us, really. You're right. I mean, this was almost just leading into that next topic, the banking stuff, because it is really, it's like, it's not that we, using notes or something to trade with isn't the problem. It's how it's manipulated now. And right.
Absolutely. If it were free market, anything like money and things like this, if it were in our control and there weren't an institution of force, I tend to always come back to the fact that government is the problem. I'm an unashamed anarcho-capitalist. And I think that the problem is always the gun in the room. As soon as there is an institution of coercion, which has the so-called power of legitimate initiation of use of force, that's when all the problems start. So, I mean, for me, I would wish to not be governed. If only we could go away, a few of us, and just have a little patch of turf somewhere where we could be the not governed people, and then we could flourish under a system of non-coercion. And then hopefully that would be the beacon that shows everybody else. But of course, I doubt they'd let that happen.
No, you're right. I mean, in truth, I know they can't have any examples of like that like people might want to get ideas.
Yeah.
But yeah, you should talk. Have you talked to John Hamer at a time zone? That would be easier. But he knows a lot about the banking, and he also agrees like that anarchy, actually true anarchy, is actually a good model. People don't really understand what anarchy is. They that's also kind of misrepresented and seen as a thing of violence, or but it isn't at all. I see you're a musician, so my partner and I also play guitar and songwrite and everything.
So. I'm a keen musician. I like to write songs. I'm not getting much time for it at the moment because I'm writing my book. I'm writing a book on how to find truth. It's sort of epistemology and philosophy and techniques to how to think through things to find truth. But that's Shannon. Any closing thoughts then after this highly interrupted conversation? Problems.
Well, I would recommend reading my books.
Of course.
You can find me at my website, is wifirefugee.com. It's wifi-refugee.com. And my books are there and links to them. So, I definitely, right, all these things we've been talking about today, get into like a lot of detail about these topics and interrelated ones. So very heavily referenced, and big 800-page books, some a couple of them. So
great. Well,
yeah, but I hope that would help people, and give them ideas, and about, I do have a lot of solutions as well, and at the end of my last book, my last two books. So
excellent. Well, I shall have all the links and pointers and all that good stuff on the show notes to this podcast. So, well, thank you so much for joining me. I do apologise. We've for the internet disruptions. We've been interrupted about 4 times, I think, in this conversation. But thank you so much for joining us. We didn't really get to touch much on CBDCs, the central bank digital currencies, as a tool. But maybe we can have another conversation and pick up a few more topics on a day where the internet's a little bit more alive.
Yeah, definitely, that would be great.
Lovely.
Okay,
well,
thanks,
thank you. Yes, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you, everybody, for watching. And do remember to visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's stacks more on there. And please join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.